What's up, ladies and gents? Let's take a look at another Practice Regents exam. This is the January 2020 exam, and in this video we will look at the multiple choice questions and run through questions 1 through 28 to make sure you have a firm grasp of the history, shall we? Alright, so let's take a look at number 1 here. It's a document about Tokugawa Japan. Okay, so if you're thinking of the Tokugawa shogunate, this is like, the first time period of your curriculum, like the world in 1750. Well, Tokugawa Japan should have been a part of that unit of study for you guys. Okay, and basically the general theme is that Japan, prior to the Tokugawa shogunate, was using feudalism. So feudalism is like this decentralized political structure in which local landlords, the daimyo, kind of run their own realms without much interference from the central government. Okay, and this is attributed to a lot of factors, but mostly due to the fact that Japan is separated into a series of islands. Okay, and also too, the technology just wasn't there for the government to have effective centralized rule. Right? You need effective roads, bridges, communications networks. Japan didn't really have those things. But that process of centralizing Japan begins with the Tokugawa regime. Okay, and part of centralizing rule is taking authority away from the daimyo, those local lords, and putting all decision making into the hands of the central government. Okay, so let's take a look at number 1 here. What was an important contribution of the Sankin Kotai, meaning alternate attendance system, to the modernization of Japan? Okay, and like we've talked about in previous videos, oftentimes the questions that correspond with the sources have like two different purposes, if you will, right? The first one is testing your ability to read and understand the source. And then the second question or third question often makes you connect that source to something else in history. Like maybe it'll ask you about a cause for the event in history, right? Like the historical circumstances. Or maybe it will ask you about an effect of that particular development in history. In this case here, right, number 1, an important contribution, this can be answered directly from the source. Okay, so take every single answer choice, plug them into the source, and see which one applies. Okay, and if you were to read the source here, in the video I have a couple of key lines underlined that help you understand what the source is about. Okay, but if you were to take a look at this, if you read the source fully, you would see that number 1 is your answer here. Japan's people developed a stronger sense of national cultural unity. Okay, and that's something that is in the second paragraph in that second line there. The modernization of Japan was to promote the intellectual and cultural unification of the country. Right, so with this alternate attendance system, the daimyo were forced to essentially live in the capital city, at least part of the time. Okay, so everyone's being exposed to the same ideas, same values, same culture. And eventually, due to the fact that everyone is kind of clustered together, you've got unification, right? Everyone has kind of shared values there. Okay, so number 2, the purpose of the alternate attendance system is similar to the purpose of what? Okay, so only number 2 applies here. King Louis XIV of France required nobles to stay at Versailles. Okay, that's the general theme of the document. King Louis is requiring the same exact thing. Okay, France during the same time period is also looking to centralize its authority over the nobility. Okay, and that feudalism or decentralized rule, that was a big part of European life ever since the fall of the Roman Empire. Okay, and by the time you get to the 1400s, Europe is emerging out of the Middle Ages, and governments are looking to become stronger. And part of that is taking power away from the local lords and putting that power into the hands of the central government. So we see that same thing happening in France under the absolute monarch, King Louis XIV. Okay, questions 3 and 4. These questions refer to a source that talks about some of the problems France faced prior to the French Revolution, which kind of gives away one of the answers already. Okay, when you're looking at a source, remember, try to figure out when the source was written, who wrote it, and where it was written, because this information should help you explain or understand what the source is about without even looking at the questions. Okay, or looking at the content of the source, which could be helpful because sometimes these readings are really difficult. Okay, in this case, we have the Little Ice Age, how climate made history, 1300 to 1850. Okay, if you didn't know, Europe experienced a couple hundred years, more than a few hundred years of lower temperatures. Okay, and when temperatures are lower, agriculture becomes more difficult. And if you have less agriculture, you have less food being grown, and less food means higher prices for food, right? Basic supply and demand type things. Okay, so the poor harvest could not have come at a worse moment. France had entered into an unfavorable trade treaty with England in 1776. Okay, when trade is unfavorable, that means one side is benefiting and one side is losing out in the deal. The pact reduced import duties on English goods, the notion being to encourage French manufacturers to mechanize production in response to enhanced competition. Wow, that's a loaded sentence. Okay, let's try to make some sense of that, right? Import duties are taxes on imported goods. So in France, they took the import duty away from English goods. Okay, so if I'm not putting taxes on English products coming into the country, that means the English products coming into the country are going to be cheaper. Okay, which sounds like it could be a good thing, but perhaps there's something problematic here, but we'll take a look. Okay, the reason for doing that was to encourage the French manufacturers to mechanize production. Mechanizing production is another way, really, of talking about the Industrial Revolution. So what are the effects of that, right? A flood of cheap imports from across the Channel overwhelmed the cloth industry. So all these English products that were made cheaply because the English already had the Industrial Revolution, they were pouring into France, and they were sold at a cheap price. Cloth production alone fell by 50% between 1787 and 1789. The 5,672 looms in Amiens and Abbeville in 1785 were down to 2,204 by 1789. Okay, so basically French production of clothing is drastically reducing here. Why? French people are buying cheap British-made products, which are being mass-produced in British factories. 36,000 people were put out of work. Okay, so people were losing their jobs. In Paris, this is towards the bottom. In Paris, the government subsidized bread prices out of fear of the mobs, but to no avail. Okay, so people are losing their jobs. They don't have any money. People are freaking out. So what does the government do? They spend their own money to help offset the price of bread, to subsidize something. This is kind of confusing, but it's basically when the government gives businesses money in return for lowering the price. Okay, we do this here in America a lot, right? The government tells, like, let's say the corn manufacturers, hey, we want people buying American-made corn, so we want the corn prices to be cheap. So you farmers, you're going to sell your corn at a really cheap price, and us government officials, we will make up the difference. We will pay you. Okay, we're basically going to pay you to make sure that your corn prices are cheap. Okay, so the government here is paying stores in return for the stores selling cheap bread to consumers. Okay, but this wasn't enough to basically offset the fact that people are freaking out. It says, but to no avail, meaning the consumers in France are still upset with the government. The situation was soon out of control. Sounds like the mob is angry. Sounds like the mob cannot afford to put food on the table because the mob lost their jobs. Right? And who's that mob looking to blame? They're blaming the government because the government messed with the tax laws in the country. Which claim related to the economic situation in 18th century France is most directly supported by this passage? It's going to be choice 4, right? Efforts to stimulate industry in France through trade agreements caused unemployment. Okay, when the question is asking about what is directly supported, meaning which one of those 4 claims can be proven using the source, it's only choice 4 that's going to apply here. Look at choice 1, right? A surplus of grain hurt French farmers. That's not reflected in the source at all, right? We're talking about a little ice age here, right? And a little ice age is going to not create a surplus of grain, it's going to cause a deficit of grain. So choice 1 is one of those like opposite answer choices. Subsidized bread prices led to improved living conditions. Doesn't sound like improved living conditions. Sounds like people are losing their jobs. And then choice 3 says economic competition with England led to agricultural innovation in France. I don't know. I'm not seeing agricultural innovations taking place in that source, right? I'm not seeing people adapting to the Little Ice Age by growing different types of crops, right? It doesn't seem like a good situation. The only one that makes sense is choice 4. Choice 4 is directly shown in the source. So here's number 4, right? Number 4 is one of those situations in which we are basically trying to find an effect of what's being shown in the source. Which event was caused in part by the conditions described in this passage? Basically, the question is asking, this development in history caused what thing to occur later in history? It's choice 4, the French Revolution. You have high price for food, you have people out of work, you have an angry mob. Those are the things that lead to a French Revolution, okay? Among other things, like the unfair tax structure. But maybe you remember how in, like, I think it was October of 1789, women from Paris stormed the Palace of Versailles out of their anger due to food prices, and they captured the king and the queen, and they forced them to go to Paris. And basically, we're going to tell the king and queen how it's going to be from now on, right? They redrew the French Constitution to at first create this constitutional monarchy. If that sounds confusing, we'll talk more about that a little bit later, okay? But your answer choice here is 4. Angry people, high prices lead to the French Revolution. Okay, questions 5 and 6 are about the relationship between China and England in the middle of the 19th century. Okay, the source is China in Transition, 1517 to 1911. And it's an excerpt from a letter written by a Chinese commissioner to Queen Victoria in 1839. And if you remember anything about that time period, this is the time where the British and the Chinese were fighting over the whole opium situation. Okay, so let's do some backstory here, right? The British have an unfavorable trade balance with China, right? So what does that mean? It means that the British are buying from the Chinese, but the Chinese are not buying from the British. Okay, so what does that mean? That means British money is going to China, but British merchants are not benefiting at all from interaction with China. So basically, Britain's trying to find something that the Chinese will buy to kind of even out the trade balance between the two countries. And ultimately, what the British decide to do is take opium and sell it to the Chinese, okay? Illegally, mind you. This is not something that the Chinese government wanted. And if you were to take a look at the source, that's exactly what's being talked about here, right? The fact that China is upset about the British, okay, who are selling opium in China merely to, as it's shown in sentence 2, realize a large profit. And the Chinese commissioner here is basically saying a little bit later on, how can foreigners return injury for the benefit they have received by setting this poison to harm their benefactors? Okay, so calling it poison, harming the Chinese people, right? At the bottom it says, you do not wish opium to harm your own country, but you choose to bring that harm to other countries such as China. Why? Question 5 here. What was Lin Zexu's purpose for writing this letter to Queen Victoria? It's to attempt to stop the flow of opium into China. That should be plainly apparent here. What is a long-term consequence of the historical development discussed in this 1839 letter? Okay, so again, a long-term effect or a result of the source being discussed. Okay, it's going to be choice 1. Establishment of British spheres of influence in China. Okay, so just to give you some of the backstory for that history, right? The British continued to smuggle opium into China, despite the fact that the Chinese government is not happy about the situation. Okay, they fight the Opium War as a result. Britain wins, right? Because Britain has superior military technology. So what happens next? They sign the Treaty of Nanjing. The British get Hong Kong and access to other Chinese seaports. And the British obtain something called a sphere of influence in China. And a sphere of influence is a form of indirect rule. So the British would not control China directly, right? There wouldn't be a British government inside of China. But what a sphere of influence allows you to do is control the trade in a given area. Meaning, basically, you can force the Chinese people to purchase British-made products without fear of competition from either local manufacturers or other European powers. Okay, so in this particular case, this is a way for Britain to obtain a new market in China. Questions 7 and 8 come from a source, Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto of 1848. Okay, this is a very confusing source. Remember your history about people before you actually read the source, right? You should remember Karl Marx was the founder of, like, communist ideas. And communist ideas develop in response to the horrible things that took place during the Industrial Revolution. And not to say that there weren't good things, but the Industrial Revolution did lead to, in a lot of cases, child labor, okay, really low wages, really long working hours. In this case, this source talks about one aspect of the Industrial Revolution that's definitely important. It's the idea of division of labor. Okay, with division of labor, you don't need skilled employees anymore. Okay, so basically I can hire somebody off the street, give them maybe an hour or 2 of training. They stand in an assembly line, and let's say you're manufacturing like a car, right? And you just train somebody to put on steering wheels. All day long, 12, 14 hours per day, a car comes to you on the conveyor belt, and you screw in or whatever, hammer in the steering wheel, and then it moves on to the next person, and they add the next part. Okay, it's great for the manufacturer because you don't have to do a lot of training and you could basically hire anybody you want off the street to perform that task. You don't need skilled labor anymore. And since the labor is unskilled, you don't have to pay people a lot of money. Okay, so that's basically what's being talked about here. I will go ahead and underline some of the key excerpts from this source, okay, but the beginning kind of tells it all. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians, meaning the working class, has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. Later on in the source, hence the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance. Okay, that's a very confusing sentence, but it basically means I don't have to train somebody anymore to do a job. Okay, I just teach them to do one simple little task. And all I have to do is give them the bare necessities for survival, like a little bit of maybe a 5-minute break, maybe allow them to eat something. I don't need to provide them with any sort of full-on education. Okay? And later in the source, it talks about the stretching or prolongation of the working hours. So Marx and Engels are reacting to changes resulting from, this is question number 7, and the answer here is industrialization. Okay, the Industrial Revolution is what made the division of labor possible, and they're commenting on how it's kind of a bad thing for workers. Which action did Marx and Engels predict would change the conditions described in this passage? Again, you cannot answer this based on the source. You have to ask yourself, all right, what do I know about Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and what do they think would necessitate, or rather, what do they think would be needed in order to facilitate actual change in the industrialized parts of Europe? And that's going to be revolts by the working class, right? If you remember your basic ideas about Karl Marx, he said the only way we're going to have true change is if the working class rises up against the industrialists, right? Against the wealthy people, right? Government reforms are nice, but even something like minimum wage, Karl Marx would argue, is not enough to promote true equality, right? Even the person making minimum wage is not going to be wealthy, and they could probably barely afford to live off that minimum wage. Okay, so he thinks the only way you're going to have a true equal society is if the poor rise up. All right, let's move to numbers 9 and 10. And these are about League of Nations mandates. So let's talk about some of the historical context for this particular map, because I think it'll help you answer the questions. Okay, so this part of the world, right, where you see on the map Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, prior to this map, these were parts of the Ottoman Empire, right? A massive empire, and the Ottomans should have been part of your unit on the world in 1750. Okay, another empire that tried to centralize its authority. It was super huge, so it contained many different ethnic and religious groups, and the successful Ottoman leaders would often try to use religious tolerance in order to keep the people together. Okay, and that worked to a certain extent for a certain period of time, but the Ottomans allied themselves with the Germans during World War I. Okay, and we all should remember that the Germans lost World War I and World War II, right? So the Ottoman Empire is a defeated empire, and here come the British and the French, right? They roll in and they carve up the Middle East to suit their own needs. Okay, but they call these places mandates, not colonies. Okay, and what a mandate is, it's basically it gives permission to the British and the French to temporarily control these parts of the world until those parts of the world are deemed ready for independence. Okay, so essentially the British and the French were supposed to help the people of the new country of Syria, the new country of Iraq, the new country of Palestine, get them ready for independence, and then independence would eventually be granted. Okay, but effectively these places would ultimately become colonies of the British and the French. Okay, so the division of the mandates into these states caused future conflicts because, really tough, because you can't really answer this question based on the map. You just have to know some of the history associated with these developments. Okay, and when you get a question about mandates in the Middle East, you should also think in terms of what took place in Africa during imperialism. Right, the European powers had a scramble for Africa. They held the Berlin Conference, where they redrew the map to suit the needs of the Europeans. Right, no Africans were present. The same thing happened here. Right, the British and the French redrew the map of the Middle East. Okay, and when they did that, they effectively put people together that don't really have a history of liking each other so much. Okay, so for example, a country like Iraq, when they redrew the boundaries of Iraq to suit the needs of the British, they put two groups of Muslims together that historically did not really like each other so much, the Sunnis and the Shias. Okay, so number 4 here is your answer. The boundaries failed to fully recognize competing religious and ethnic interests. Number 10 is similar. Okay, the situation shown on this map played a direct role in the what? The only answer choice that makes sense here is choice 3, series of Arab-Israeli wars. And you might say, well, how can this map lead to a series of wars between two different groups? Well, because of the boundary changes again, right? Putting people together that don't necessarily like each other, often that leads to conflict, right? So there is a connection there. But if you were to look at Palestine specifically, that's British control. And after World War II, the British are the ones who decide, right, because they're the ones in charge, they decide to come up with a partition plan to give half of that land to Arabs and half of that land to Jews, right? And we should all remember that that idea basically led to conflict in that region, right? Because not one side was satisfied with that. The Arabs wanted full control, the Jews wanted full control over that territory, right? That's religious territory that's important to both groups. So they fight over it, right? Since the British were in control and the British came up with that partition plan, that is going to cause the wars between the two sides, right? That's like the root of the Arab-Israeli conflict, is that European interference in the region. All right, so 11, 12, and 13 refer to quotations attributed to Kemal Ataturk. Okay, so let's do some backstory before we even get into this, right? When you see a source about Kemal Ataturk, you should be able to get these questions right without even needing the source so much. Okay, so Kemal Ataturk was the leader of this group called the Young Turks, and the Young Turks were interested in breaking free of the Ottoman Empire and creating a modern, secular, nationalistic state inside of it. Okay, and when World War I was over, they were able to do that, right? They broke free of the Ottoman Empire, they created a new country called Turkey, and they fought successfully to keep their independence from the British and the French, right? If you went back to the previous map, you'd see that Turkey was not one of the British or French mandates. And Kemal Ataturk would begin that process of creating a modern and secular Turkey, secular meaning non-religious. Okay, so if you were to take a look at here, at these excerpts from Kemal Ataturk, they refer to Western ideas and modern ideas, right? Look at the bottom. It says women's rights. In the Ottoman Empire, under Islamic rule, women's rights were a bit restricted, okay? But now women are going to have freedoms, okay? We're going to use a language based on Latin script. If you didn't know that, English is based on Latin script as well. It's the characters that the Romans used, okay, instead of Arabic. Okay, so we've got modern ideas, we've got Western ideas. We got choice 1 for number 11. Turkey adopted a more modern Western orientation. Number 12, during which historical period did Ataturk make these remarks? This is tough, okay, because you have to know some timelines in your head a little bit, right? The Regents is not really going to ask you about specific dates so much, but you should have an idea of the timeline of events. Okay, World War I happens, which leads to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which leads to the development of modern Turkey, and then later on, World War II happens. Okay, so therefore, Kemal Ataturk creating a new Turkey falls between the world wars. So choice 1. Okay, if you're wondering when does this happen, this is like the 1920s. There you go. Okay, the Persian Gulf War, that's the 1990s, long after. At the time of Israel's creation, that's 1947, 1948, so it's a little bit after the fact. At the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, that's 1979. Okay, so long after Kemal Ataturk rose to power. So the only one that makes sense is choice 1. And since Kemal Ataturk pursued policies of modernization and westernization, let's take a look at number 13. That should be nice and easy now. The overall change desired by Ataturk is similar to the change enacted in, and your answer is going to be choice 3, Japan under the Meiji. All right, let's take a look at 14 and 15. Okay, so here we have 2 images instead of text, which is great. It's nice to get a break from the dense readings sometimes, am I right? So here we have the German invasion of Poland, September 1st, 1939. And if you were to analyze this map, okay, whenever you analyze a map, make sure you're looking at the map key, right, to kind of get a sense of what's happening here, right? So you see the Germans approaching Poland from the left-hand side. You see the Soviet Union entering Poland from the right-hand side, right? And this refers to the Nazi-Soviet pact, which is also kind of being reflected here in the second image, right, where Hitler and Stalin are bowing to each other, right, so as a sign of respect. But if you look at the source, right, they're saying bad things about each other, which kind of illustrates the fact that even though the two sides came to an agreement prior to the invasion of Poland, it was kind of a tense agreement. They didn't really like each other so much. Okay, so if you don't remember that history, the Germans and the Russians, okay, under Hitler and Stalin, agreed not to attack each other, which is what Hitler wanted, right, in order to avoid Germany having to fight a two-front war, because that two-front war is what kind of undid Germany in World War I. Okay, so the events shown on this map in this cartoon were related to the outbreak of which conflict? The German invasion of Poland is the event that starts World War II. Okay, so if you could just keep that in your head, you don't even need to really know the date. Okay, if you see the Germans invading Poland, you should just know that 39 to 45 is like the general time period of World War II. So that signifies World War II. Which event ended the cooperation shown in these documents? Okay, the cooperation is, again, a reflection of this Nazi-Soviet pact, this agreement not to attack each other, and an agreement to divide Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union. But when Hitler invades the Soviet Union in the early 1940s, that undoes the Nazi-Soviet pact, or sometimes the Regents likes to use the word nullified. It nullified the Nazi-Soviet pact. Okay, so for 15, your answer is 3. The German invasion of the Soviet Union ended the cooperation between Hitler and Stalin, and then the Soviet Union becomes an ally of the British, the French, and the Americans in World War II, and eventually helps cause the defeat of Hitler and Germany. All right, questions 16 and 17 refer to a really simple and straightforward source. It says August 8th, 1945. Okay, so this is still in the time period of World War II. And it says 60% of Hiroshima was obliterated by the lone atomic bomb dropped on Sunday. It was announced in Guam last night. That's really all you need to know from the source, or all you need to read from the source to kind of figure out what the answers are. Which event is described in this excerpt from the New York Times? Well, it's Hiroshima, it's 1945, it's atomic bomb. Number 16 is choice 1, use of a deadly weapon against Japan, right? And that atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and then a couple days later on Nagasaki is what brought World War II to an end. 17 is very, very tricky though. Take a look. Which historical development followed the events described in this excerpt? Look at choice 2 here. This is like a trick answer choice. It says the war in Europe came to an end. In my experience, kids would pick this quickly because it says the war came to an end. Okay, but the war in Europe had already ended. Okay, the war in Europe ended in May of 1945 when the Germans surrendered, but the Japanese carried on. Okay, so using atomic bombs on Japan does not end war in Europe. It was already ended. So choice 2 is not your answer here. Choice 4 is your answer. The US and the Soviet Union began an arms race. Okay, once that atomic bomb is used and the Soviet Union sees that, they say to themselves, okay, we have to now compete with the United States. We have to develop our own version of the atomic bomb. And the Cold War thus begins. Okay, that's the only answer choice that makes sense. Look at choice 3, right? Japan annexed Korea and Manchuria. You know, if Japan's being bombed with nuclear weapons, they are not in a place to take over other places, right? They're about to lose World War II. I don't think a losing country is going to add other places to its empire at that moment. So choice 3 does not make sense. And Japan entered a period of isolation? Absolutely not. Okay, after World War II, the United States and Japan would become close allies, despite being enemies in World War II. Huge trading partners, right? Think about all those cars that come from Japan, right? Honda, Toyota, Nissan. That's not isolation. That's more interconnectedness. So again, the only answer choice that makes sense is choice 4. Okay, what we have next are a couple of maps, map A, map B, with the years 1945 on the left and 1971 on the right. Let's look at the questions, okay? Which concept is most closely associated with the situation presented in map A? 4 answer choices. Let's talk about all 4 of them. Appeasement. Okay, appeasement is this idea that you're going to give in to a bully in order to prevent conflict. I don't see that happening in map A. Choice 2 is Zionism. Zionism is a word for Jewish nationalism, and it refers to this idea that after World War II, we should give Jewish people their own country, because if they are the majority group, they will no longer be subjected to persecution. That is not something that takes place in India. Okay, that's in Palestine in the Middle East. So choice 2 is not in the map. Number 3 says non-alignment. Non-alignment is a Cold War term, and it refers to developing countries like, let's say, in India or in Indonesia or Vietnam, Afghanistan, countries like that, countries like that would not take a side during the Cold War. So they would not join either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, right? Because they're not really in a position to take a firm military position against the other side, right? They're too busy rebuilding after a long legacy of colonialism. Which brings me to number 4. Colonialism is your answer here. Why? It's 1945 and India is labeled British India. That means the British are in charge of that place. Okay, so colonialism is the same thing as imperialism. So for number 18, it's choice 4. If you look at the map on the right, 1971, you should notice some changes. On the left-hand side, we now see Pakistan. On the right-hand side, we now see Bangladesh. So something had to be responsible for kind of breaking India apart into these 3 separate zones. And the answer is going to be number 1, nationalism. Okay, nationalism, again, on a simple level just means pride in your people, right? In your group. But that attitude causes all of these other side effects. Okay, if I have pride in my group, I don't want my group being dominated by somebody else, or I don't want my group having to follow the rules of another group. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about Hindus and I'm talking about Muslims inside of India. Right, the Muslims in that part of the world did not want to be subjected to a Hindu majority. So the British decide, much like they did in Palestine, to divide the place up, right? To partition it out because of these nationalistic attitudes, right? Pride in your own group and not wanting to be dominated by somebody else. The Muslims separate themselves and create their own country called Pakistan, where they would be the ones in charge of the country because they would be the majority group. Okay, nationalism in this case broke apart a region because there were multiple nations within it. Okay, so nationalism can unite people, right? If the Germans are spread all across Europe, nationalism can bring those Germans together because they feel like, hey, we have pride in being German. We should all work together to make the German people stronger. Well, in this case, nationalism broke apart the Indian subcontinent because there were multiple nations living within it. I know it's very confusing. Just remember the big idea: nationalism can unite, nationalism can divide. Okay, numbers 20 and 21 refer to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. Okay, the Khmer Rouge were a communist group that rose to power in Cambodia in the 1970s. Okay, at the same time, basically as the Vietnam War, or towards the latter half of the Vietnam War. And right away, the source kind of talks about what the Khmer Rouge did when they became the leading group of that region. And Pol Pot is the guy that you should associate with the Khmer Rouge, in case you didn't remember that. He's not mentioned here specifically. Okay, but towards the end of paragraph 1, it says, their goal was to remove foreign influence in Cambodia and turn everyone into a simple worker or farmer. And then in paragraph 2, it says, a little bit later on, the Khmer Rouge death list included those in the opposing regime, intellectuals, doctors, and teachers. Okay, basically the Khmer Rouge committed genocide against all the groups that were non-communist or who they considered to be a threat. Okay, so genocide or ethnic cleansing is a word that we unfortunately have to associate with the Khmer Rouge. For which purpose could this passage best be used? It's going to be choice 4 here, understanding the impacts of Khmer Rouge policies on Cambodian society. Okay, look at choice 1. It says, learning about the reasons for the rise of the Khmer Rouge. No, because if you were to look at the whole source, it doesn't talk about how the Khmer Rouge rose to power. It just says, hey, the Khmer Rouge are now in power, and this is what they did. So I can't choose choice 1. Okay, it's not talking about life in Phnom Penh before the Khmer Rouge, so choice 2 does not work. Explaining the contributions of the ethnic minorities within Cambodia. It's not talking about the contributions of the minority groups. It's only mentioning how the minority groups, or the smaller groups, were persecuted. Okay, it's not talking about the good things that they've done. So choice 4 is the only one that makes sense here. Which historical development is most similar to the situation described in this passage? It's going to be choice 1. Nazi actions in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s. Why is that the answer? Well, the Nazis committed genocide against groups that they determined to be undesirable, and the Khmer Rouge in this source are doing the exact same thing. Okay, the other answer choices don't make any sense, right? Look at choice 2. Nelson Mandela, he didn't commit genocide, right? He committed protest against apartheid. That's not the same thing as genocide, right? So the theme does not match. Ayatollah Khomeini's rise to power in Iran in the late 1970s. That's, again, not genocidal action. It wasn't great for the U.S. people that got taken hostage, okay? But genocide was not committed. And then choice 4, I'm seeing this more and more on the Regents exam. Argentinian mothers protesting in the Plaza de Mayo in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, protesting is a different theme from genocide. So I can't pick choice 4 here. And again, this is something worth noting because, again, it comes up on the Regents a lot now. Basically, the military overthrew the democratically elected government of Argentina, okay, and stripped people of their freedoms, and people who were considered enemies of the state were arrested and often executed, okay? So the mothers were protesting that. So this is kind of tricky because what the military did could be similar to what the Khmer Rouge did, but choice 4 is not talking about the Argentinian military, it's talking about the mothers protesting it. All right, questions 22 and 23. These are tricky. The cartoon comes from the year 2000. It's got the Great Wall of China. It's got a communist flag hanging out, behind the Great Wall. But you see a horse labeled with all of these Western brands: CNN, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Apple, Burger King. Okay, and it looks like a horse is being rolled up to the city gates. This is like the Trojan horse idea. Maybe you know your Greek mythology, okay, or the poem of the Iliad, the Odyssey, right? Poems by Homer talking about the Trojan War. Well, the way the Greeks won the Trojan War was to roll up this horse to the walls of Troy and then, present it as a gift. And then the Trojans brought the horse behind the walls. And then at night, all the Greek soldiers came out from inside the horse and burn the city to the ground. Okay, so the horse is like a disruptor. It's like a thing that's going to cause problems for the people on the other side of that wall. So which concept is best illustrated by the horse in this 2000 cartoon? The answer is globalization, right? It looks like American brands are arriving on the doorstep of China, right? Interconnectedness, trade, all the same thing as globalization. Okay, so choice 3 is your answer here. Which concern facing China's government in 2000 can best be inferred from this cartoon? Choice 4, right, because Trojan horse. Internal disruptions resulting from rapidly opening economic development zones. Why is that the answer? Because Deng Xiaoping, okay, remember that name? He was the leader of China in the 1970s, 80s, and really early 90s. And he's the one responsible for bringing elements of capitalism into China. He carved out parts of China into what we call special economic zones, where foreign businesses are allowed to operate without the interference from the Chinese Communist Party. So this is what's going on here, right? Foreign businesses are opening up in those economic zones. And it seems like the cartoonist has this point of view that, since they're depicting these businesses as a Trojan horse, these things are going to come into China and kind of undermine Chinese society. Okay, so cause disruptions. That's the Trojan horse idea. So it's globalization. It's Deng Xiaoping bringing in some capitalism in those special economic zones, and the cartoonist taking the position of how these businesses will disrupt China. Okay, a few more. These are kind of tricky. 24, 25, and 26 refer to this source from Elizabeth Robles Ortega, who began working in the foreign factories at the age of 14 and was blacklisted from employment after participating in independent union drives in Mexico's northern border. She later worked as an organizer for the Service Development and Peace Organization. Okay, and this is written in 2007. It's kind of hard to know much about the source based on that description, okay, but when I look at it, I'm talking about Mexico and foreign factories. So you should remember that since really the 1990s, foreign factories are opening up in Mexico, manufacturing products in Mexico, and then shipping those products back to places like the United States, all because of NAFTA. Okay, the North American Free Trade Agreement reduced the trading barriers between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. What does that mean? It means we're dismantling the tariffs, keeping products cheap. So what does an American business do as a result? Well, a lot of the times they decide, why don't we open up the Levi's factory in Mexico? We'll hire Mexican workers to manufacture the jeans. And then since there are no tariffs as goods cross borders, we're going to just drive the jeans back across the border into the United States and sell the jeans to Americans that way. Okay, so that will help the Levi's Corporation because now they don't have to pay American workers high American wages, and therefore they are going to profit more off of jeans. In theory, it might benefit the Mexican worker because they're going to get access to a job, but the person manufacturing the jeans in the American Levi's factory has now lost their job. And this is a byproduct of globalization. As the world becomes interconnected through trade, manufacturing is moving to places where labor becomes cheap. And that's basically what's being referred to in the source here, are the effects of NAFTA. Okay, so the story that I just told you kind of reflects an American point of view of how NAFTA maybe benefited Mexican workers by giving them those jobs, but hiring Mexican workers at low wages may not be so great for Mexican people. So let's read parts of this source together. NAFTA has led to an increase in the workforce as foreign industry has grown. Okay, so she's saying there are more people working. That's great for Mexican workers. They are reforming labor laws and our constitution to favor even more foreign investment, which is unfair against our labor rights. So it looks like the Mexican government here wants more foreign investment, right? So more Mexican workers are going to be employed, but maybe the rights of those workers are going to be denied. For example, they are now trying to take away from us free organization, which was guaranteed by Mexican law, right? So it sounds like the laws are being changed to prevent Mexican workers from unionizing, right? Unionizing means they're going to fight for better pay and better conditions. And maybe the Levi's company won't want to open up their factory in Mexico if they have to pay the people more. So the Mexican government, right, just wants those jobs in Mexico, is kind of willing to look the other way on labor rights. Ecological problems are increasing. This is later on in the source. A majority of women are coming down with cancer, skin and breast cancer, leukemia, and lung and heart problems. Okay, so despite all these new jobs, which sounds great, these jobs are paying people next to nothing. The environment is being contaminated and people are becoming sick. So look at number 24 here. According to Elizabeth Robles Ortega, what is the basic cause of the problems being described? Okay, so the answer here is choice 3. The Mexican government's focus on obtaining foreign capital. Okay, capital is with an AL, is like investments, right? The Mexican government wants foreign businesses to open investments, open factories inside of Mexico. And that's the cause of all these other problems. Based on this document, what is the author's primary goal, right? So she's a reformer, right? So she is a person who's looking to kind of make changes. So she's probably bringing up these bad things in order to make some kind of a change, right? So in this particular case, it's number 2, right? To gain protection of workers' rights and improve the workplace, right? By pointing out all the bad things, a reformer is looking to create some kind of a positive change to benefit those who are being negatively affected. Which situation directly influenced the author's point of view? Point of view is author's feeling, right? Author's opinion. Right, so you might want to ask yourself, well, how does Ortega feel about NAFTA? How does she feel about this foreign investment? She definitely has a negative point of view, right, because it's causing people to suffer. What caused her to have this feeling? It's going to be number 1 here, right? Having learned of medical problems suffered by factory workers. So her negative point of view about NAFTA is caused by the harm that it is doing to Mexican workers. 2 more, 27 and 28. Okay, we've got a simple political cartoon, and we've got a person there on the right-hand side labeled IMF. And if you don't know, the IMF stands for the International Monetary Fund. And this is an organization based in Washington, D.C., and many different countries participate. And what they do is they provide loans to developing nations. Okay, a developing nation, sometimes called a third world country, looking to improve itself. Well, sometimes it's hard to improve unless you have jobs for people. And sometimes you need money to get a factory started to create those jobs. So the governments of these developing countries would go to the IMF and say, hey, here's a proposal. We want to open up a factory. We need some money. Can you loan us some cash? So that's kind of what's being referred to here, right? The IMF guy is telling the borrowing nations, okay, in this case, these developing countries, the IMF is telling those countries what they need to do in order to secure those loans. You have to cut spending, so your governments have to spend less money. You have to open markets, okay, meaning you have to open up stores that are willing to sell foreign products without tariffs, okay, so free trade, no restrictions to trade. And you have to privatize. Okay, so what does privatize mean? That means allow businesses to open that are privately owned that can obtain a profit. Okay, so no communism, no socialism, just capitalism, right? Private property, private ownership of businesses is a central feature of capitalism or free market or laissez-faire. So based on this cartoon, This is number 27. The views of the IMF are most closely associated with which economic system? This is tough because you can't really find the answer specifically in the document, like word for word. You have to kind of make some connections, right? How do I know it's choice 3, capitalism? Because it's talking about open markets, which means free trade, and privatization. Okay, private ownership is a defining feature of capitalism, so number 3 is your answer there. Based on this cartoon, what is one function of the IMF? Okay, it's choice 2 here, right? Establish guidelines for nations that are asking for loans, right? How do I know that's the answer? Well, the guy is specifying the rules. If you want to borrow money, these are the rules that you have to follow. Okay, so choice 2 is the only one that makes sense here. Look at the other answer choices, right? Look at number 1. To implement tariffs to protect borrowing nations' markets? That cannot be the answer. Why? Because in the list of the rules, it says open markets. Open markets means no tariffs. So choice 1 can't be your answer, right? Choice 1 says implement tariffs. That runs contradictory to the source. Choice 3, to encourage nations to apply for loans in order to increase their spending. Well, that can't be the answer because the guy is saying cut spending. Another opposite answer choice. Choice 4, to assist borrowing nations in taking control of businesses. No, because he's telling them to privatize. Okay, governments don't own businesses when it's capitalism. So it's not, the IMF is not telling the governments to take control over businesses. It's telling them to privatize. Again, it's the exact opposite. All right, so again, that's the January 2020 Regents. That was a brief overview of the multiple choice questions. Check out the links below to get a PDF copy of that Regents exam so you can kind of look it over yourself. And then in subsequent videos, we'll look at the short answer section and the enduring issues essay that goes with this Regents. If you are looking to study more for your Regents exam, feel free to check out some of my other videos here on YouTube. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.